much, Giovanni, and let me tell you how happy I am to help kick off this Region Europe program. And to do this here, and to do this with Europeans and non-Europeans. And let me start with something that is sobering, but that I want to be the beginning of this conversation. And of course, this cannot be just a monologue from me to you. I'll give you a few thoughts for you to ponder, and what will matter is that after that, you will have the floor to put the questions, comments, observations, things you agreed with, and even things that you disagreed with. This is a democracy, so it's okay to disagree. Do that after these initial remarks. And let me start again with, in a way, a sobering moment, which is that these are not easy times for Europe. And let me start by quoting someone I read a lot these days, because she helps me understand, and she helps put a bit of light in these very obscure moments, is Hannah Arendt. She's got this incredible quote that I want to put to you to start this conversation. Hannah Arendt says, "The devil thrives on apathy and cannot survive without it." And I want to start here because I think the worst enemy of Europe today is apathy. Is to believe that Europe's future is already written. Is to disengage by fear that our voice and our words don't count. Or that if we engage, it will not make a difference. That we will not make a difference. And yet, if I look at Europe, history proves me wrong. In 2019, when lots of Europeans went and voted in the 2019 European elections, and let me tell you, this was the first European elections where there was a noticeable increase in the vote of young people. And young people went to vote because young people wanted Europe to tackle climate change. This is how the European Green Deal was born. When COVID hit Europe, European governments learned that what they had used as method after the 2008 financial crisis, basically that every country had to care for its own people, would not work. And for the first time in European history, European governments decided to borrow together, to invest together. They took common debt to invest together in European priorities. When Russia invaded Ukraine in violation of international law, in violation of the UN Charter, the UN Charter is important because it says that countries cannot violate by force, change by force the borders internationally agreed. Well, when Russia did that, European governments supported Ukraine. And not only militarily, not only defense-wise, not only from a budgetary point of view, all of the above, yes, but also by welcoming 8 million Ukrainian refugees in Europe, and for the first time in European history, agreeing to treat them as if they were European citizens for the point of view of education, healthcare, and integration into European life. And frankly, to all of those who said that Europeans will not last long in doing that, they've been proven wrong. Europeans continue to support the fight for freedom in Ukraine because they think it's their own fight for freedom. So, the beginning of this conversation is to understand that as Europeans, we have agency. That you have agency. That our future will be what we want our future to be. But we have to want it. And in wanting it, we have to understand that this is not the moment for business as usual. The world is changing in three fundamental ways, and I want to describe the three ways for you. The first is we can see a weakening of respect for the law, for rules, for international agreements and norms. Is changing the law for power. International rules, the international based order, was predicated on the fact that governments would accept to limit their worst instincts. Governments decide on the laws. Governments decide on the norms. And they did that because they thought it was better. They would be better protected. They would be able to better manage the integration into the global economy by respecting a set of rules, of norms, of agreements. But what we are seeing today, especially by some important systemic actors, is the dismantling of this international rules-based order, the replacement of rules by power. When the US administration decides to increase its tariffs on trade and decides to treat countries in a discriminatory manner, big tariffs for the right, low tariffs for the left, low tariffs for rich countries, high tariffs for poorer countries. When the US administration does that, it's violating the rules the US decided at the time to have in the World Trade Organization. When Russia violates the United Nations Charter, as not just any country that is violating the UN Charter, it's a country that has a permanent seat in the UN Security Council. When international humanitarian law is violated, because wars and conflicts also have laws. When these laws are violated, whether it's in Gaza, whether it's in Myanmar, whether it's in Sudan, when civilians are left to starve to death, we are replacing norms by power. Now, of course, a power-based international order is a daunting prospect for many countries that have little power and will be subject to constant pressure by those that have power. So it creates uncertainty and it creates volatility. The second way in which our world is changing is we are seeing a weaponization of the international economy and international trade. You know, the economy is understood to be a source for growth, a source for jobs, a source for innovation, a source for creativity. And what we are seeing today is that the economy is turning into an instrument to coerce countries to accept concessions or conditions, sometimes economic, but often non-economic, So when the US had decided to threat the European Union with tariffs on trades, the EU had to face a choice. And the EU ended up accepting higher tariffs on the US market than the tariffs that the US would have on the European market. Why? Because the EU knows that it needs the US to keep supporting it in Ukraine. The US is conscious of this power that it has, and it's ready to use it to coerce the European Union into opening its market to US goods without equivalent concessions on the US side. But imagine this conversation between the US and Brazil. When the US decided to increase tariffs on Brazil, it didn't just want to have access to the Brazilian market. The condition that it imposed on Brazil was that it would free former President Bolsonaro that had been sentenced by an independent judiciary in Brazil. So the coercion wasn't economic, it was very much political. The objective was not to open the Brazilian economy, it was to change the judiciary system in Brazil. And imagine the conversation between the US and Denmark when the US tells Denmark that it wants to have Greenland, or the conversation between the US and Panama when it says it wants to have the Panama Canal. So what we see as another feature of our time is the weaponization of the international economy and international trade. Coercion instead of growth as the objective. Or let's imagine that members of NATO are asked to spend 5% of their GDP on security and defense. And that this 5% be spent on purchasing US military and defense equipment. So all of this is a major change for an economy where the goal was basically to manage the interdependence of these economies for mutual benefits. The third big change internationally that has a big impact on the European Union is the rise of the security agenda. Security is taking the upper hand over efficiency. Now, the only problem with this, of course, in a world of growing insecurity, in a world where your economy can be weaponized, it's normal that the security agenda takes more prominence. Now, the problem is that security has a very zero-sum game mentality. For me to be more secure, you've got to be less secure, and vice versa. And this is very much contrary to this idea of win-win outcomes. So, of course, at the time of growing military and defense and security, it will be inevitable to increase the focus on spending on military and defense. But what do we do with the part of the agenda that is not defense, it's security in the broader sense? How do we deal with climate change? That is one of the largest sources of insecurity and instability around the world. How do we deal with the social insecurity that will come from social unrest if we don't deal with inequalities in the proper way? How do we deal with health insecurity, which so happened during COVID? So, in addition to security being zero-sum game, we also have to think of security in terms of global public goods. And let's make sure that when we talk about protecting the citizens, we don't go back to the very well-known old protectionist agenda, which is what some countries are doing, abusing the necessity to become more secure by insisting that protecting is protecting their domestic industries. So all of this puts the European Union in a very uncomfortable situation. Why? Because the EU is itself a rules-based system. The EU as a construct is a rules-based system, and when the rules-based system is diminished or weakened, it weakens also the EU. Because the EU thrives on managing and profiting from economic interdependence. And because the EU has traditionally bet on open markets, on solidarity and democracy, all of which are today under pressure. This is why I think these are not easy times for the European Union. Now, how did we end up here? I wanted to take a step back. We are in 2025, but I want to go back to 2008. Because 2008 is a pivotal moment to understand how we got here. Three things happened in 2008 that we did not read well at the time, but that make a lot of sense when we look at them today. 2008 was the year of the great financial crisis, a crash in the US housing bubble, a crash in the US financial system that had repercussions all across the world because the financial markets are enormously integrated. In 2008, Russia fought a war against Georgia. This was preceded by a set of so-called color revolutions in Kyrgyzstan, in Tajikistan, in Georgia, in Ukraine, countries that saw uprising of citizens wanting less corruption, more transparency, fair elections, asking for democracy. And what they got was a Russian invasion. The third thing that happened in 2008 was the Beijing Olympics. Remember that amazing Olympics in Beijing? Up until then, China had followed this very well-known tactic of Deng Xiaoping that said, hide your strength, bide your time. Be modest and build your strength, but then don't boast about your strength while you're building it. This was the philosophy that China had followed since it decided to open and reform its economy and society. In 2008, something changed. Beijing wanted to show that it was strong, and it put up an incredible show in the Beijing Olympics. It was China's coming out. Had we paid a little bit more attention, we would have seen some of the threats that are connecting with today's reality. In the US, citizens attributed the financial crisis to international trade and to the rise of China. They became skeptical and then turned outright hostile to open markets and to international trade. Never mind that the 2008 problem wasn't a trade problem. It was a financial problem, but they couldn't make a difference. They felt it was open markets, meaning trade, that was the reason why this crisis happened, this crisis had a big impact. It hurt consumers. It increased inequalities in the US. And this hostility to trade only grew after 2008. In 2008, we also had the election of Barack Obama as President of the US. It was an incredible political moment, but it opened the way to the arrival of Donald Trump. And the hostility only grew bigger. The plan was to make America great again, a very nationalist agenda where the focus is on sovereignty, national interests, and little spaces for international cooperation that it's seen only through the eyes of whether or not it would be helpful for the US. In 2008, China understood that American-style capitalism was too risky, that it was better to invest in capitalism with Chinese characteristics, quote unquote. Now, what's this capitalism with Chinese characteristics? It's investing in a very determined way in the technologies that would make China a leader in the 21st century. And this is why China invested in Made in China 2025. Big investments in semiconductors, in biotechnology, in quantum computing, in all these technologies where China has become or is becoming a world leader. Also with this idea of dual circulation. Dual circulation meaning relying on foreign markets, but relying also on homegrown products for home consumption. So we call this de-risking today. And the Belt and Road Initiative to export excess capacity in construction to other regions around the world, and through that to get an important control over nodal routes for international trade around the world. Had we paid enough attention in 2008, Europe would not have lost the following decade swallowing the financial crisis. And this is what happened. The initial result, the initial way in which Europe dealt with the financial crisis was essentially austerity. It made the financial crisis an issue of moral hazard and divided European countries into virtuous and sinners. The virtuous were okay. The sinners had to be punished. They had to fix their own economy without realizing that Europe's strength is that virtues and sinners work together to strengthen the EU. So we lost a decade in improving the European competitiveness and deepening the European single market. We did reinforce what had become a liability. We did reinforce our monetary system. We did reinforce partly our fiscal capacity, but we lost the decades. So essentially, 2008 started a gradual process of US disengagement and inward-looking, Chinese projection of power, Russian aggressiveness towards expressions of democracy around it, and European weakness that has brought us where we are today. Since this 2008, two structural elements have shaped the European landscape. The first one is Russia's growing aggressiveness. From observing what has happened, I wouldn't attribute this to NATO's expansion. I would attribute this to democracy's expansion that was threatening to a system that thrives on an authoritarian regime. I am not here to pass judgment. I'm here to describe what I see. And what I've seen in this period is a growing aggressiveness on the side of Russia, with growing attacks to weaken Europe, whether the attacks are interference in the public information spaces, whether it's through hybrid attacks, whether it's attacks on social infrastructures, whether it's on cyber attacks, and now even with drones flying unauthorized over the skies of Europe. And if there are Latvians in the room, they know this because they have the drones flying over their heads regularly. The other element that is structuring the European Union's landscape is the Sino-American rivalry. It's centered on technology, because this is what will give, they feel, each one of them feels that this is what they will give them the supremacy in the military and defense sector in the 21st century. Now, this Sino-American rivalry and technology, where each one of them tries to make sure that the other one does not move very fast or very far, started with what President Biden's national security advisor called small yard and a high fence for American technology exports to China. So very limited set of technologies for which America would put very high fences so that those technologies would not reach China. And of course, what we saw was China responding with a small yard with a high fence. And of course, the US has something that China wants, but China has something that the US wants. So in the meantime, the yard has become bigger and the fence has become higher. And you will know, because you read newspapers, that right now there is a big confrontation between the two, in that for every measure that the US takes, there is a response on the Chinese side. And the US side is very high costs for ships that have been manufactured in China to pay fees when they get to harbors in the US. Technology that is subject to growing scrutiny. And on the Chinese side, growing restrictions to the US access to rare earths. Rare earths are minerals that are necessary to power the technology that makes electric vehicles, batteries, semiconductors, and the rest function. Without rare earths, there is no way these industries work. So you can see how the weaponization of the economy is reaching a crunch point between the US and China. Now, the European Union is in a way trapped in the middle of this conversation. And it's trapped because the US would like Europe to be in the front line of responding to the Chinese, and the Chinese are not making it easier for the European Union in that they are providing support, not kinetic support, but support with dual-use goods for Russia's fight against Ukraine. So, in a way, the European Union is trapped in a situation in which it feels rather uncomfortable. Now, what can the European Union do? Well, the first thing is that the European Union has a choice to make. In political terms, Europe has to decide how it wants to play its cards. It has cards, but it has to decide how to play them. So in my view, there are two choices, and there is only two. There's no 3 or 4 or 6. There is two. Either the European Union decides to use the cards that it has to shape its own future, to have an impact on the future, or the European Union decides that others will shape its future. Whether others are voters in Midwest in the US, whether it's the Chinese government, whether it's Putin himself. The choice is Europe's choice. Now, of course, this means that the European Union has agency, but it has to decide how to use this agency. Let's first look at the European citizens. What are citizens saying? Because in a democracy, what citizens say is pretty important. If I look at the last Eurobarometers, the Eurobarometers are opinion polls on the pulse of European citizens that are taken by the European Commission and the European Parliament. They've been doing this for the last 30 years with the same methodology. The last Eurobarometer is telling us the following: 90% of Europeans want more European unity to face the growing challenges that Europe is facing. 2/3 of Europeans today feel that their attitude towards Europe is either very favorable or favorable. It's the highest it's been in 3 decades. 78% of Europeans believe that Europe requires more and more common projects which require common financing. This is what Europeans are saying. So the question that I always ask myself is, how will governments use this political capital that they have? This is a political capital, right? How will governments use this political capital? How much will they use this political capital to do things in Europe? How much will they use this political capital to do things at home? How much will they Europeanize the political landscape at home? Or how much they will make it purely about domestic choices? Jury is out. But if I had to give them an advice, not that they have asked me, but if I had to give them an advice, looking at where Europe is today, I think this political capital requires to be deployed around 3 priorities. Let me briefly describe them for you. The first one is investing to build Europe's deterrence capacity. Some people call it military. I call it deterrence because it's not just about military. It starts with Europe understanding that it needs a common strategic defense culture. You know, when European countries dream, citizens in European Union member states have different nightmares. If you're in a country like mine, the nightmares look south. But if I'm sitting in Romania, my nightmares pretty much look east. And if I'm sitting in Denmark today, my nightmares look west. European nightmares need to become much more European. That's what I call a strategic culture. So to build a European deterrence, Europeans need to build this common security culture. And they need to do that, in my view, one, because there is war, open kinetic war in the European continent, something that had not happened since after the Second World War. This is what's happening in Ukraine. But I think it's more than that. It's because without a deterrence capacity, Europe does not have economic power. This is what happened in August. The EU had to accept a deal with the US on trade because it did not have deterrence capacity. So it's not just about war, it's also that the asset the EU has, which is its own economy, cannot be fully deployed if you don't have the capacity to protect your own citizens. So how do we build this deterrence? Partly it has to do with spending more. And governments have said that they will spend more. Actually, they are already spending more. But it's not enough to spend more. They have to spend better. We can't be in a situation where every European Union member state, and there are 27, each one of them have specifications, their own specifications for their own weapon system. 27 tanks, 27 missile systems, 27 bullets, 27 cybersecurity standards. We need to spend better. And we spend better if we build also a single market for the defense industries, which, by the way, will give us a bit of a technological edge. Remember that a big part of the technological advancements have come from the security and defense side. This is true in the US, this is true in Russia, this is true in China. I'm citing the three because they are the biggest spenders together with Japan. So, is spending more, is spending better, and is spending together. So, joint projects that will give the European Union enough muscle in this sector. How are we doing? As I said, we are doing good on spending more, but we have a double challenge. We are increasingly purchasing defense equipment from the US, and this it locks us in our future purchases, it locks us in our own loss of technology, and we are too slow in consolidating the European Union's industry. Although I have to say, what happened last week with a big coalition of three big European players on the satellite sector, Thales, Airbus, and Leonardo, here in Italy, to build satellites at scale in Europe and to operate them is incredibly important. And it's a step in the right direction. Why? Because space is one of the areas where Europe is weak. And without the space, you can't operate the drones. And without the drones, you've lost your ability to deter your enemy. So, things are moving, probably a bit too slow. Let me say that obviously a lot of this has to do on building the European deterrence has to do with the fact that the US has weakened the deterrence capacity of NATO. You know, a military alliance can only deter if your enemy thinks that you will shoot if he shoots. But if you make shooting conditional on whether you spend more, you buy my weapons, you be nice to me, your deterrence capacity is weakened. So what we are facing now is a weakened NATO deterrence capacity, which obliges us Europeans to spend more, spend together, spend better, but also to think about how we will take more responsibility for operations, whether in NATO or through a coalition of the willing, if ever that moment comes. And it will come when a ceasefire is reached in Ukraine. The second priority is to build a strategic resilience. How does one build a strategic resilience in Europe? Is by deepening the single market. Two great Italian former prime ministers, Enrico Letta and Mario Draghi, have given us all we need to know to build this strategic resilience. They've told us what we have to do to build this strategic resilience. And let me give you an example of what this strategic resilience means. If we are capable of deepening the European Union single market in a 0.1%, that is enough to compensate 1% loss in access to the US market. In other words, if the European single market can absorb more of our own production, we become more resilient to the coercion that other third countries may impose on the European Union. 0.1 to compensate for loss of 1. That's pretty powerful, I would say. So if we were to build this economic resilience, strategic economic resilience, where should we start? We have to do this in energy, because energy is a huge factor of competitiveness, and we've realized how uncompetitive we are on energy the moment we were cut off the Russian energy market. But it is possible. It is possible to decarbonize our energy markets. It is possible to build more interconnections. And it is possible to invest more in our electricity grids. All of this is possible. I come from a country, Spain, whose energy price is 30% below European average. 30% is one of the most competitive in Europe. Why? Because it has decarbonized its energy mix. We've got lots of sun, got lots of wind, got a bit of water. You can make your energy cheaper. Now, in Europe, there are different views about what sources of energy. Some want nuclear, some don't want nuclear. That's fine. Let every country make its own choices. But let's make sure the choice is decarbonate, the choice is interconnect, and the choice is strengthen electricity grids in the country so that they are more capable of absorbing this transition to a decarbonated energy. The decarbonization of the energy system is one of the biggest resilience factors that we can have. We don't have to be dependent on price fluctuations and coercion of those that have energy, fossil fuel energy. We can do that, and we can do that at scale, and we can gain competitiveness. The second is digital, with the digital single market, with the digital in particular helping the European startups to scale up. And the third one, and this is my favorite, and it's my favorite because it will help build the resilience of the rest, is capital markets. You know, Europe is not a poor continent. Europe is a rich country, is a rich continent. It has incredible savings, but those savings don't capitalize in European capital markets. They flow to the US because markets are more liquid, deeper, more integrated in America than they are in Europe. So instead of complaining that those savings of Europeans go to the US, we can deepen the European capital market. I would say that we also have to be very careful in these capital markets of the combination between technology and currencies, with stable coins now appearing in the market that are going to pose also a challenge for the euro and for the monetary sovereignty of the eurozone. How are we doing in building this economic resilience? Good news is we now have a date, and a date is very important to oblige everyone to fix what they have to do with an end in sight. The date is 2028. 2028 has become the new 92, which was the big drive to build the single market. We now have 2028. This is good news. It's good news also that we kind of have an architecture. It's 3 verticals: energy, technology, capital markets, and 2 horizontals. What are these 2 horizontals? The so-called fifth freedom. You know that in Europe we have freedom of goods, movement of goods, services, people, and capital. We are going to add the 5th one. Free movement of knowledge, of science, of innovation. Very important, because this is what we want to become. A single market that is powered by knowledge. And the second horizontal, that is a so-called 28th regime. We are 27 countries, and there will be areas where the 27 will have a lot of difficulties in converging. Why we build the 28th? Some form of Delaware regime for Europe, where startups will have, for example, a one-stop shop, one 28th regime that will be recognized in the entirety of the European Union. That is the good part. What are we missing? We are missing the role of the Commission as the conductor of this orchestra to oblige member states to walk the talk. And we are missing a sense of the trade-offs. You know, in Europe everything is about a trade-off. You give this to get that. How do we organize this for these 5 pillars that I have mentioned? The third and final is my favorite. It's called democracy. It's Article 2 of the EU Treaty. Read Article 2 of the EU Treaty. Because it says not what economy we are or what geopolitics we want. It says who we are. It's freedom, it's rights, it's human rights, it's the tough stuff. It's much more difficult than to do a 28th regime. This democracy today is under a lot of pressure. It's under pressure from the outside, from those who say that democracies are too slow, that they don't produce results, that they're not efficient. But they are also under a lot of pressure from within. It's not that we Europeans are virtuous and the rest of the world are laggards. We have a problem also inside the European Union. It's very important to recognize this. If we don't recognize this, we will not be able to solve it. In the past, those that didn't like this European Union, they wanted to leave. They wanted Brexit, Frexit, Italexit, and the rest. But since Brexit happened, it's not very fashionable to argue for leaving the European Union, because it's too costly. So now they've invented a new slogan. It's called changing the EU from within. This is what these forces that oppose European integration, again, I'm not passing a judgment, I'm just giving you a picture so that we can then have a conversation. But they say, let's change the European Union from within. By the way, this is exactly the same sentence that is used by the Vice President of the US, J.D. Vance, when he comes to Europe. He says, change the EU from within. That's the code word. Now, let's just be clear that those that are pushing for this changing the EU from within want a different kind of EU. And their favorite target is Article 2 of the EU Treaty. democracy is about legitimacy. We have the possibility to choose. We choose governments. We choose regional governments. We choose mayors. We elect after a debate, and we make a choice. And we have to make sure that those choices are not corrupted by a corrupted political debate. And let me tell you, and I'm telling you this, which is exactly what I tell my students in Sciences Po. Remember that it's easier to build agreements than to agree to disagree. It's difficult to agree to disagree, because we generally want to impose our views on the others. But in a democracy, it's not about imposing a view on others. It's about learning to build societies with people that think differently, with tolerance and respect. Now, democracy is also efficiency. It's also producing results that will improve people's life. It's about social policies. It's about social safety nets. It's about welfare policies that improve people's life. And if we don't work on that, democracy will also be eroded. Finally, democracy is also about coherence. It's to do what we say and to say what we do, avoiding double standards. Now, you've understood why democracy is the toughest part of all three. This is the tough part. Let me end by paraphrasing a baseball player. I know that this is the country of football. This is the continent of football. I want to paraphrase a baseball player. His name is Yogi Berra. He used to play for the New York Yankees. And paraphrasing Yogi Berra, I'll tell you that the strength of the European Union will be 90% the responsibility of governments, and the other half would be the responsibility of citizens. All of us. So don't let anyone take away the agency that you have. Remember that the European Union, in the end, will be what you want it to be. So make sure you want it. Thank you very much, and now the floor back to you.
Okay, so thank you very much, Arancha, for this inspiring, not only inspiring lecture, but also passionate, which is very important. You know, what did you tell me when we were having lunch some 1 hour ago? That is, making people dream about the European Union is like making them dream about Frankenstein, you know.
Making them laugh.
And laugh at Frankenstein. So this is very important, you know. This is very important, and this is your contribute, to this and our contribute as well. So now we open the floor to your questions, and don't hesitate to raise your hand, to ask for the mic, to share your comments, to raise your questions, and so on. Please, let's start. Please introduce yourself, first of all.
Yes, sure. I'm Rareș Verduț, and I'm from Romania. I'm very grateful to talk with you. But I have just one question. You astutely mentioned many of Europe's most pressing current problems. But you left out a big one, and this makes me wonder. The immigration crisis. Do you feel that the refugee issue is still relevant in the question of Europe's thrival in the emerging international order? Or do you feel that it's not relevant?
Thank you. Thank you. Let me take this. Really appreciate this question. First, let me rephrase your question. I don't think we have a crisis of migration. We have a crisis of management of migration, which is slightly different. Migration is not a crisis, but how we manage it may be a crisis. We didn't manage it very well. And why didn't we manage it very well? Because we have not built an understanding between the different EU member states of what migration means to us today. We have not done that homework, and therefore migration has been taken hostage by many in Europe that want to scare us, that want to divide us, and want to polarize us. Let's accept for a moment that migrants is one thing, refugees is another thing. Refugees are those for whom we have internationally agreed responsibilities. There is a convention, 1951 International Convention, built to protect refugees. That is, those that are fleeing their countries, or those that are fleeing within their countries, because they are subject to prosecution or persecution for different reasons. Race, religion, sex, and the rest. Okay, let's agree that we leave them aside, because for them, all members of the international community, especially the Europeans, Article 2 of the EU Treaty, have undertaken to respect their rights. So let's assume that we deal with the rest, meaning those that are knocking at the European door because they think that in Europe they will find a better future. And let me first look at the facts. Every European Union member state has a very bad demographic profile, meaning the number of births is below replacement rate. Let's start with this, right? And in parentheses, let me tell you that this issue of migration is also a matter from within the European family. Because we've seen parts of the European Union ending to go to other parts of the European Union. But let's assume that this, you know this very well. You know this very well. I know this very well. After the 2008 crisis, right? But let's assume that this is not what we are dealing with, because for that we've got to think of freedom of movement in Europe. And what we need to do in Europe is not only help those that want to move to other parts of the EU, but also help those that want to remain where they are, and we are not doing that well enough. But let's assume again that this is a different problem. Let's look at the problem that you had mentioned, which is one of migration. So first, the demographics in every country are not good. Not good. This country is a very interesting example. My one is an interesting example. Germany is another very interesting example. My country of adoption, France, is another interesting example. Meaning all of them are very interesting examples because all of them have very bad demography. So there is only two differences in Europe. Countries who accept that they've got a very bad demography and want to organize migratory flows, and those who are doing it without saying it. So my sense is, if we really care about democracy, not demography, if we care about democracy, the only way forward for Europe is to organize migratory flows in a more intelligent manner. How to do that? Pushing our borders further to the countries of origin, making sure they are safe, secure, orderly channels for those that want to migrate to Europe to come. Do this with a sense of where it's needed. Do this with proper conditions, not for exploiting people, which is what's happening in a lot of our countries, where we are exploiting those people. In other words, doing this in a manner that is humane and dignified. If we open these regular channels, the pressure on the irregular channels will diminish, because people will see there is a way to do this through the front door rather than going through the back door. Final point. We have incredible amounts of human traffickers, and these are not somewhere else. Sometimes the human traffickers are in our societies. They are making a lot of money trafficking with people. Actually, they make more money today trafficking with people than trafficking with weapons or with drugs. That's a problem. And in this one, we have to be merciless. Right?
Thank you so much for your answer. You touched on a very interesting topic, and I would just like to get a quick clarification, and then I'll allow my colleagues to step in. To what would you attribute the demographic decline in Europe?
So it's a combination of factors. Partly it's got to do with individual choices. Let me open up parentheses. I hate it when I hear people say, well, in order to address the demographic deficit, all we have to do is ask women to have more kids. Sorry, but I have a very fundamental question with this, because partly it's got to be about freedom of choices. But the second big problem we have is that there are many that would like to choose to have children and find it prohibitively difficult to do. They've got to make tough choices. Like, for example, quit my job or have a children. Or have a child and not have enough money and resources to combine those with work, or simply to pay for what it costs. So partly it's got to do with personal choices, but partly it's got to do with what kind of care infrastructure do we have in our countries. And that is also important. The burden of, we can't just simply leave all of this to how well or how badly you can deal with the costs that being a mother, being a father, or being a parent represents today. So individual choices and collective choices is what, and collective needs is what we have to make sure they work.
Thank you. I appreciate your answer.
Thank you.
Hi, Paul, Professor. Okay. My name is Clemens, I'm from Greece. Very nice to meet you, Paul. I just wanted to ask a clarifying question about the comment you made. So it's culture. How do you envision it? How do you envision it? How do you imagine Europe possessing such a thing as a stability culture? Do you think can we do anything or something more pluralistic? And how can it be achieved, if it can be achieved at all?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I have observed that depending on, you see every European Union member state has a past. I come from a country that was a dictatorship during almost 40 years, right? So talking about increasing the military spending is not easy. But we have to talk about this, right? We've got to talk about this at the national level. We also have to explain the moment we are in today. We've got to look at what kind of threats we face. We've got to unpack this. Many people, I do this a lot in my country because I feel that this is a contribution I can make to citizens making informed choices. It's all about making sure that we make informed choices. You can choose, but you have to know what you're choosing from. Many people tell me in Spain, Russia is very far. First, Russia is only one part of the story. It's an important one because it's in an open kinetic war in the European continent. But wars are not just simply kinetic wars. You have disinformation wars at scale. They are extremely damaging to our societies. And you don't need tanks and drones to fight disinformation, but it's also a war worth fighting. We've got climate change. It's a war. Actually, climate change is generating increasing numbers of refugees that are not recognized by the 1951 Convention because they are not fleeing persecution. They are fleeing territories that have become inhabitable. They are fleeing territories that are disappearing underwater. But this is not envisaged in the 51 Convention, right? But this is another war we are facing. So to build this culture in Marine, we've got to unpack all these issues with our citizens. This has to be part of the political landscape. When politicians make this part of the public discourse, they oblige all of us to look at them, to debate the for and the against. We need that. I'm not sure we have this at the moment. And it's not because a country is in the extreme of the European Union that is not subject to the same threats. The target is not country A, B, or C. The target is European Union, irrespective of where you look. So debate, discuss. We've lost the ability to do that. We have surrogated that to put in tweets on X and posts on Instagram or videos in TikTok. That's not an alternative for debate. A democracy cannot thrive on TikTok. Sorry for that.
Yes?
Thank you. Hi, thank you so much for all of your insight. I'm Mariana from the Double Degree Master Program of this University, European Studies, and I had a question concerning the 28th regime that you mentioned. Specifically, a lot of, as it usually does, some criticism has been brought up concerning this proposal, specifically concerning trade union concerns about workers' rights. So I wanted to know what your opinion, your overall assessment of the proposal would be. In my understanding, there are two main, let's say, directions of criticism. One point is that of trade union concern about workers' rights, and also how would you explain the fact that despite this is intended as a way to facilitate startups and small businesses, it is mostly big corporations that are the ones lobbying for the implementation of this type of proposal. Thank you.
Very smart question. So first, the 28th regime for now is for startups. Obviously, and why is that? Because this is like a low-hanging fruit in a sector where bureaucracy is killing European Union member states' startups' capacity to grow. So, of course, there are many actors that are saying yes to the 28th regime because they know that if we start with the startups, we may move in a different direction and expand it to other sectors of the EU. I'm not sure that the social protection will be a primary target of the 28th regime, because on the social protection, which is by definition a national competence, the the philosophy in the EU is to try to use this to push social protection up, not to push social protection down. So, in my view, the 28th regime is more suited for conditions, requirements that have to do with bureaucracy, bureaucratic considerations, rather than social protection rights, which are not, for now, they are certainly not into this category, and I doubt they would be, because the whole philosophy, the social agenda, which is again a national competence, has been to try to use the EU to ratchet up rather than to ratchet down. So I see the 28th regime as extremely useful for everything that has to do with approval processes and approval procedures. I would do a great 28th regime for recognition of university certificates, for recognition of professions. Why is it that if I'm a doctor in country A of the EU, I've got to go through a very lengthy process to get my certificate recognized in country B? That's where I would use the 28th regime, to make sure that the freedoms that we have work, not to push where we don't have freedoms.
Okay, thank you for your answer. So overall, you don't think that this would push towards the minimum standard, the minimum compromise, but it would still keep the social rights as they are, or even up, because as you said, that is the overall goal of the...
I mean, the 28th regime is not for social rights. This is not how it is envisaged. That can be the future. I doubt it. I doubt it.
Thank you so much for your answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your lecture. I'm Joel from this university. I study in Turin. And I wanted to ask you about a point that you made of the three priorities of deploying the political capital of Europe, and especially what regards democracy. Because, like, as you mentioned, democracy nowadays is under a lot of pressures, and we need to answer to this pressure, like from within the European Union, like I think about liberal democracy maybe in the Union, and pressure from the outside. But how do we deploy actually this political capital, like practically? How do we defend democracy? How do we use the power of political capital of the European Union to defend democracy within the Union and maybe even outside the Union?
Yeah, this, I mean, let's say that it's easier said than done. If it was easy, I wouldn't put it in a list of tasks, right? I would say, I mean, take this at the personal level, right? What can you do? Yeah, even as a citizen, think of what you can do. I mean, the beautiful thing of democracy is that the actor is not just the government. The actor is each one of the citizens. If we want to do the energy union, it has to be decided by governments. But if we want a strong democracy, it's you and you and you and you and you and me that can make it stronger, right? Now, there are many structural elements we need to look at to ensure there is an informed debate, which is normally how a democracy works, right? You make informed choices, you make informed decisions. The informed part is extremely important today, so fighting against disinformation is, for example, a very important area to make democracy work and work a little bit better. Because if the debate is false, if the facts are wrong, if the arguments... Let me tell you what happened in Paris at the beginning of, on the 7th of October attack on Israel. All of a sudden, is there any French person in the room? No. Okay. So maybe this would sound familiar to you. What we saw was, all of a sudden, on social media, an incredible amount of posts showing buildings all across France tagged with swastikas. Swastikas. Nazi symbol, right? And the message was growing anti-Semitism in France. On closer look, there were 2 buildings in Paris that had been tagged, and those tags had been made viral on social networks. It was organized. It was done by 3 men paid by you know whom to create animosity between France's 2 largest communities in Europe, the Jewish community and the Muslim community. Both in France. France hosts the largest Jewish community in Europe and one of the largest Muslim communities in Europe. Thus was a manipulation of the information space. This was disinformation with the purpose of creating upheaval within a member state. The reality is that during 2 days, the entire media ecosystem could not but talk about that. In the news, in the radio, on newspapers, on social networks. Publicity was all fabricated. I'm giving you as an example, I could give you 1,001. The area of disinformation is a crucial one to allow for a proper debate within our democracies. Many of you, I'm convinced, will end up working in this space, which is necessitating a growing number of expertise. And this is one of the areas that can make, so breaking it, identifying it, attributing it, and preparing the citizens to see the difference between true and false will be essential if we want to have a democracy that thrives. This just is an example. Other than what you can do individually, which is obviously use the power that you have as an actor in democracy when you make a choice, when you ask for accountability, when you ask questions, when you demand responses, which is also something I would strongly encourage you to do, since you can.
Good morning. My name is Anhal. I'm from Lebanon, and I'm in UNITO for 1 semester. First of all, thank you so much for all the fruitful information that you gave us today. It's really interesting. And especially for me coming from Lebanon, from the global south, from the Middle East, we would want a stronger Europe and a more moderate Europe, because Lebanon or other countries in the Middle East have been bearing the consequences of a very far-right conservative America. Constantly involved in politics, involved in military, involved in economy, etc., etc. So, first, you mentioned having a shared military spending or some sort of unity in military spending in Europe for the European countries in the European Union. Is there a more focused route to have some sort of a NATO but only for Europe, like a European defense unit? Because for the past couple of years we've been living in a unipolar world, but we've seen the consequences of having 2 powerful rivalries or 2 powerful camps only. Like, the world really needs more of a like a plurality of powers and a plethora of camps maybe, or unions or coalitions or alliances. So is there like a focus to have some sort of a European defense unit just to counter the aggression from both sides of the world?
So let me first take the word plurality. I use it all the time. I never talk about the global south, because there is no global south. There is a plural south. That is a much better representation of the world we live in. And I talk about the plural South like I talk about a plural North. Like I talk about a plural East and a plural West. The world is plural. But the distribution of power in this world is not as plural as the actors in the world. And the place where it's most striking is in the international system, whether it's the financial system, the trading system, or the political system with the UN Security Council, where this plurality of voices is not properly represented. Doesn't represent the plurality of today, it represents the plurality of the 20th century. You know, this question about where does the EU build its deterrence capacity is one that Europe has grappled with since the beginning of the European Union. Actually, in 1952, there was an attempt at building the European Defence Community. It was even before the European Economic Community. It was the European Defence Community. And, you know, imagine the conversation. It was a very uncomfortable conversation because, of course, Germany was in Europe, but France had just defeated Germany. So the idea of doing a military alliance with a country you have just defeated was kind of a bit complicated. Then you had the Soviet Union that had contributed to the defeat of Germany, but in reality wanted to plant its flag in Europe. That was another bit of a difficult conversation. So, be it as it may, the Europeans were capable of building this European defense community. It was done by the original members of the original six. But when it came to ratification of this community, and it was a very interesting example of how Europe is built, right? Not in a linear way, because it was a European defense community, but in reality it had lots of bridges to the Atlantic Charter, that is the predecessor of the NATO, right? So it was never clear which way Europe would go. Would it build its own security, or would it build the security of the continent around the US? The fact of the matter is that French Senate refused to ratify the Charter, which means that from 1952 onwards, the security of Europe is linked to NATO. Now, NATO is no more than the sum of all the members of NATO, where they put all their armies, their military to work together, they exercise together, they deploy together, but the commander-in-chief of NATO operations in Europe is always an American. It was all okay. It was a good deal, right? For decades, the chief of military operations, the commander-in-chief was an NATO general, an American general, fine. And Europe was purchasing a lot of its defense equipment from the US. That's what I would call a win-win, right? Except that this win-win doesn't exist anymore. It's been put into question not by Europe, it's been put into question by the US. I'm not passing a judgment into whether this is good or bad. For me, it's a fact. So if in a military alliance, the biggest shareholder in that military alliance puts this alliance into question, it means that it has less deterrence capacity. The whole point of having an alliance is to have capacity to deter your enemies from attacking you. If they feel you're weak, they will attack you. So, Europe now is grappling between building the so-called European pillar of NATO, meaning taking more responsibilities within NATO because the commando structures are very well oiled and every military in Europe knows how to use them, but take more responsibility, leave less in the hands of the US, or build a coalition of the willing, which is what a number of countries are doing outside NATO. Now, you would have understood that I said a European coalition of the willing, not an EU coalition of the willing, because in this coalition of the willing, there are Europeans that are not in the EU. Brits, Norwegians, maybe Turks. They are not in the EU. They are in NATO, and they are in Europe. So the whole point, I don't think there will be an EU military alliance. There will be more and more a taking responsibility by European countries of the necessity to work together to build this military capacity and be in a position to defend themselves if that moment comes and the US was not willing or capable to do that with Europeans.
Hello, thank you very much. My name is Lina. I'm a student of philosophy in Italy. I wanted to ask about the point of culture. You talked about culture as one of the deterrents, especially if I'm not mistaken, a strategic defense culture. That's an interesting point nowadays, since especially due to the immigrations, and I would like to thank my colleague for the question that he asked about this phenomenon that we have experienced as war of cultures here in Europe, but also in the United States. Of course, this kind of issues comes along with financial issues. Since, for what I understood of your point, it is the main point, and then probably going down to the cultural issue. So if people are well and are thriving, they can also be more in the position to welcome it, maybe. But I would like also to question you is, what do you mean by strategic defense? What culture do you think Europe has to defend, especially when it comes to a foreigner that comes here for whatever reason? And what countries that we are asked to defend?
Yeah, so a strategic defense culture is basically, do we have the same defense plans or not? Do we see the landscape of risks in the same way or not? Do we all feel that we have the same risks? Or do some countries feel that the risks are, for example, if you are sitting in Portugal, do you feel that the biggest risk for you is going to come from the Sahel? What does a Lithuanian think about the risk coming from the Sahel? What does an Italian think of the risk coming from Russia? Versus what does a Dane think of the risks coming from the US? You can only build a common defense if you have a shared sense of the risks that Europe faces. When you're a country, you do that at the national level. But we are not talking about building a defense of one member. We are asking the European Union to prepare its capacity to defend themselves. Against whom? Who are those risks? And how much do all 27 member states share sentiment of those risks? And this necessitates also a discussion. And planning to build tanks, and planning to build satellites, and planning to have same standards for bullets is not a substitute for a discussion about the common risks that all Europeans are clear are the risks to you. This is why I think I call this a strategic defense culture.
maybe I struggle to understand what are these risks you're talking about. What are they? Like for you, what are the risks? Are there economic risks? So you want to strengthen the economic system, if I may say it this way, in order to defend culture or to strengthen also.
It's not to defend culture. Is culture in this meaning is not culture in the meaning that you give it. It's culture in the sense of military culture. The military also have their own culture, not in the sense of habits, but in the sense of what do they consider to be big risks. So what would I consider to be big risks to Europe? Some are military, kinetic, war, open war, right? The possibility that one of the drones flying from Russia into Poland hits a target and starts a conflict between Poland and Russia. And Poland is in NATO, and Poland is in the EU. And both the EU and NATO have a clause that says any attack on a member is an attack on all. So that creates a conflict, right? Let me give you a second example. It's not kinetic, but what happens with all this infrastructure that is being sabotaged? Gas infrastructure, electricity infrastructure, submarine cables, radars in airports. All of this at the moment is being sabotaged. You've got hundreds of incidents. Last one was Munich airport was grounded to a halt because the radars were not working. No, the radars didn't work because the Germans did not know how to operate the radars. It's because they were being jammed. Another threat that I see is a threat to democracies. Interference in the information and communication space. So, a common strategic culture is for all 27 members to agree what the list of risks are and what the measures are that would be best suited to treat those risks. And this, again, is not a set. We can talk a lot about how to address them, but what are these risks is where this conversation starts.
Okay, so thank you very much. We ran out of time already. So Arancha, I hope that you enjoyed your experience at the University of Torino and that you all enjoyed this wonderful opening lecture by Arancha González.